Good morning everyone and welcome to this Perth Kinross Local Review Body meeting of the 17th of August 2021. I'm Councillor Lewis Simpson, the convener of the Local Review Body, and I'm joined today by two councillors, Councillor Willie Wilson and Councillor David Illingworth, and we also have in reserve Councillor Ian James. We're also joined by Mr David Harrison, who is the planning advisor to the Local Review Body. He's not part of the Council Planning Department and has had no previous involvement in any of the applications on the agenda today. And also by Mr Colin Elliott, who is the legal advisor for the Local Review Body, and by Mr Danny Williams from Committee Services. We move now on to declarations of interest. Can I ask if there are any declarations of interest by members on any item on the agenda today? Councillor Wilson?
None.
Councillor Illingworth?
None.
And I have none. Item 3, if we can note 2 minutes, the minutes of the 22nd of June and the minutes of the 20th of July. Thank you.
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. So we now move on to the application for consideration today. The first item is a planning application for the erection of 2 dwelling houses on land 40 metres north of 7 Kinclaven Green, Kinclaven. Can I ask Mr Harrison to introduce this application for review? You're on mute, Mr Harrison.
Thank you. As you say, this is a This is a detailed planning application for the erection of 2 dwelling houses at Ballotic and Kinclaven by Stanley. The site lies to the rear and north of the existing row of houses that front onto the public road. It slopes up to the north before rising steeply into adjoining woodland. Both proposed plots would be accessed from the existing entry that provides a private rear access road for the existing houses. And I'll just take you through some photographs now, but you might like to have page 63 onwards, which provides you with the location plan and site plans and of course drawings of the 2 proposed houses. The general sequence of the photographs will be the existing development at Kinclaven as we approach from the west, then approaching the site via the west access, site itself, the eastern access, and the existing development as seen from the east. So as you can see in the first photograph we have here, we're approaching the roadside housing at Kinclaven from the west, and we have the first of the original properties, which is now I think a lodge house to a larger property as we approach it, and the main row of houses are slightly further beyond in this photograph. So the sequence of houses will take you up the road a little bit as we go. So if we move to the next photograph, we see the 2 large agricultural buildings which you can see in your location plan. These of course lie to the west of the main group of houses, and say if we just move up the road again a little bit further, you can still see the agricultural building of the farm shed, and this is taken from that sort of hard standing in front of that between the agricultural buildings and the main public road. So we're picking up the main group of houses as it turns slightly on the corner there. The site, which you can't actually see directly into from this position, it's behind that group of houses, between the houses and the bank of woodland you see beyond. So from there, if we move up a little bit further in the next photograph, we're still catching that east elevation of the farm buildings on the extreme left-hand side of the photograph. So you can see there's a gap, as it were, between the farm buildings and the row of houses, and this is looking through that gap towards the countryside in that northerly direction. So if we move on from there and step back a little bit, again we see that gap in greater detail. Let's say this is looking north over that gap to the countryside beyond. And then swinging round towards the right of that photograph, where we catch the corner of that gap, and then beyond that the first houses on the roadside. And you can see there's a bend in the road here, sweeping round. Some of these houses are, shall we say, more original, and then of course there's been more recent development on that roadside. From there, again, if we move up the road a little bit again, we move to that western access. There are two accesses into the lane that serves the houses from the rear. So this is the westernmost of those two accesses you'll see on your location plan. And from there, if we move up into that access, we're now standing in the rear access road. The western access we were looking at in the previous photograph is on the left-hand side of the photograph. We're now standing in that access road, looking back to our earlier photographs, and you can see clearly the roofs of the agricultural building in the far distance, and then some of the countryside and fields between those buildings and where we're standing now. And then if we move round towards the right in the next photograph, we catch first of all the remainder of the field between the two. We see the access track, and then beyond that we see the site backing onto the woodland. Hopefully the red line will give you a fairly clear indication of where the site is. Moving from there up the access track, we get to the site itself, and this is at the western end of the site, and you can see the access track, the site, and then the woodland beyond in sequence. Swinging round to the right of that photograph, still standing in the access track. On the left-hand side, we've got the remainder of the application site with the access track, and then of course the back gardens of the houses that front onto the public road. So from there we move right up the access track in the next photograph, and we look at the eastern end of the application site, and then swinging round to the left of that photograph, we're looking back down from where we had the earlier photographs. We see the lion's share of the application site, and swinging round again to the left of that photograph, we see the rear of the houses that are there at the moment. As you can see, that is where people tend to get access into the back of their gardens. From there we move up into the access, which is at the, as it were, the eastern access. And this is us looking down that access, past the houses, towards the public road. So if we go down that access a little bit and turn around and look in the opposite direction back up to the application site, and then again from there stepping back further, we go right back into the public road, looking at the full length of the access between the two houses there towards the application site. Finally, from that position, if we go towards the right, we're going in the easterly direction and looking back towards the row of houses as it stands at the moment, fronting onto the public road. So if I just move to the next photograph, that leaves you with a general photograph of the application site. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, by way of background, the applicant has expressed concern regarding the processing of this planning application, which follows on from the first in principle proposal for 3 houses that was refused, and the withdrawal of a subsequent in principle proposal for 2 houses, both in 2019. The current proposal sought to address the previous objections, concerns and reasons for refusal from the Council and objectors through a detailed planning application. Toward the end of last year, the case officer indicated support for the proposal, which required to be reported to the committee due to the number of objections exceeding 5. An extension of time was agreed to enable that to take place in early 2021. The Council was contacted when the proposal was not part of the March committee agenda at that time, and it was discovered the application was being refused. The officer's explanation of these circumstances is contained in an email on page 43 onwards. Turning now to the assessment of the proposal, there are 10 houses and a large agricultural sheds on the north side of the public road at this location. It's considered that the proposal is supported by Category 1 building groups of the Local Development Plan 2 Policy 19 and the supplementary guidance regarding housing in the countryside, and also supported by Policy 1, placemaking, in terms of making a positive contribution to the surrounding area. The scale, layout, traditional design and external materials are of quality and reflect the existing housing. As an extension of an existing building group, the site is seen as according fully with Policy 19 and the associated guidance, as it is defined and contained by the topography of the rising ground to the rear and the well-established landscape features. It is seen as forming part of a compact building group. The development would enjoy a high standard of residential amenity, would become integrated into the existing layout and building pattern, and would not detract from the wider visual or residential amenity. It is viewed as a logical development, inverted commas, rounding off, close inverted commas, the existing building group. It is also noted that the existing agricultural buildings to the west extend a similar depth back from the public road as the existing houses when combined with the proposal. There are no concerns regarding the proposed access and no requirement for any additional contribution payments. The proposals are also considered to address the concerns raised by the objectors. Turning now in summary to the Officer's Report of Handling, Local Development Plan 2 Policy 19 and the associated Housing in the Countryside Supplementary Guidance 2020 are the key considerations. By definition, the proposal does not concern infill development, the conversion or replacement of buildings, brownfield land, a specific local or operational need, or innovative sustainable living dwellings. Consequently, the only category that potentially supports the proposal is Category 5, building groups. The proposal concerns an extension of an existing building group. It is accepted that the site is well defined by well-established natural features to the rear and the housing to the front. It can also be expected to enjoy a high standard of residential amenity. The quality of the proposed houses are also recognised. However, the Housing in the Countryside guidance states that all proposals must respect the character, scale and form of the existing building group and be integrated into the existing layout and building pattern in a way that does not detract from the visual amenity of the building group. The main visual impact on the character of the building group would be that as perceived by the existing residents. The existing dwellings are all along the roadside in a distinct linear pattern. The proposed development of houses to the rear of this pattern is considered to be a clear departure from the existing building pattern. Consequently, the proposal is seen as eroding and not respecting the character of the existing building group and does not therefore accord with Local Development Plan Policy 19 and the associated Housing in the Countryside Supplementary Guidance. The proposal is not assessed as raising concerns regarding residential amenity, access or flood risk. Turning now to representations. In this case, there have been 8 letters of objection, mainly concerning that the proposal the proposal being contrary to Local Development Plan policy and the Housing in the Countryside guidance in departing from the linear pattern of development and the character of the locality. In addition, there is concern regarding the impact on residential amenity, wildlife and existing trees. And finally, concern in relation to road safety and the standard of the access road. In this case, there has been a request for a site visit. There is no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. Colleagues, are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Councillor Wilson.
Thanks, Convener. Mr. Harrison, thanks for the presentation. The linear pattern, as it's been described in the report and the comments from the objectors, am I right in thinking that's been developed over the last 20 to 30 years, in that it wasn't originally an almost complete row of houses, and there had been a degree of building, if you like, infill in between the individual houses?
Yes, I think if you go back the sort of period you're describing there, that's correct. There were some older houses, but you've probably noticed from the photographs ones which have a more, so we say, contemporary look to them. So yes, as you say, in the order of 20 to 30 years ago, over that sort of period, my understanding there's been something in the order of 5 additional houses to create the, shall we say, the completeness of the roadside development.
And if I could ask one more question, please, Convener. The site itself, clearly it has road access, and as we've said, there's no flooding issues, plus a number of other things. The trees that are on site seem to me, from the photographs, to be well back from the proposed building plot. Would there be removal of any trees at all?
No. Hopefully, this photograph that's been left as the final photograph might. Sorry, we just lost it. You'll see there's there's 2 elements to the trees. There's the rising ground and a knoll with the trees you see on the right-hand side of the photograph there, which, as far as I can tell from the application site plan, the highest part of that is, I should say, out with the application site, and that's one group of trees which are should we say, set above the application site. Similarly, in the earlier photographs, you'll have seen that shall we say, a much more extensive area of woodland, excuse me, on that slightly northeastern side of the application site, which I say is again out with the application site. You may have also noticed there's an intention, or an indication, I should put it that way, of some additional tree planting to take place into the application site adjacent to that woodland.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison.
Right. Councillor Illingworth, have you any questions of officers?
Question. The houses that are proposed, are they significantly different in design or concept? I mean, massively different to the new house, the relatively new houses that have already been put in that sort of settlement?
No, I wouldn't say that they are significantly different at all. I think the design has generally taken the lead from at least probably the more recent additions to that roadside development. In fact, I think the same architect has been used in some instances. So some of the houses on the roadside are bungalows, whereas this proposal involves more accommodation within the roof space. So that would probably be the main difference in terms of form, but there's no great difference between the two in the approach.
Okay, thank you.
Are you happy with that, Councillor Lee?
I'm happy, thank you.
I have no questions, colleagues, so we can move now to make a preliminary decision. So members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do you require more information? Councillor Wilson.
I think with sufficient information.
Thank you. Councillor Illingworth.
I think we have sufficient information.
Yes, I agree that we have sufficient information, so we can now assess the case and raise the debate. Can I ask you, Councillor Wilson, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross Local Development Plan, and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us off?
Thanks, Convener. Well, first of all, I'm familiar with the site through just general circulation, and I've watched the resettlement at Conclaven grow over the last 10-20 20 and 30 years. It started off with maybe only 2 or 3 or 4 houses, and it's expanded, albeit along the roadside in that time. It's been interesting to see that. Also the farm buildings have had various incarnations of a farm shop and a cafe at one time. So it's been an area of change over the years, but it's been on a kind of phase basis and a fairly modest basis. This is a fairly major change for the area, and will be seen by residents as a substantial one. On balance, and it's a very carefully balanced thing for me, would tend to allow the review and allow the houses to go ahead for several important reasons. Firstly, what's been referred to by both Mr. Harrison, Councillor Illingworth and myself, convener, there have been changes to the housing pattern here. It wasn't always a linear pattern, it was a scatter of houses. So there has been a change. And these houses, I think, are in proportion, broadly in proportion to some of the existing houses along the roadside, albeit they're a wee bit further up the hill. I think the merits of the application are that there's a landscape containment through the trees, there's a road access, the application doesn't have any problems with flooding or with a variety of the criteria that would be. There's residential amenity is maintained. I don't think they detract from the amenity of the area as existing, and I don't think they would adversely affect the existing layout. I think the visual amenity, design and layout is satisfactory, and there are no roads and access, natural heritage and biodiversity or drainage and flooding issues, and there are no impact on the trees. So therefore I think it does tick a large number of the boxes, and I know that some of the objectors don't agree with this, but they've got their house there already, and I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be an addition of these 2 medium-sized houses on the site. There would need to be conditions, convener. One of them would clearly be a landscaping plan and confirmation of details for the road access, at least. But our officers, our planning advisor and our legal advisor can formulate any additional ones. There are the usual standard conditions of when an application becomes live and the time that they've got to complete the building of it. So I would leave that to the officers to finish off. And I think for justification, I think this is Mr. Elliott will ask me that in a moment, that it is an extension of a building group, an expansion of a building group, but I think because of its nature and scale, it is appropriate for that, and I think it would conform with the housing, the countryside policy. I simply don't agree with the planner's conclusion on that particular point about the linear nature of the site, the overall settlement. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Illingworth, maybe have your view?
Yep. I think this is the planners from the papers saw this as a very marginal decision. Sometimes they were in favour and sometimes they were against this project. I like Councillor Wilson. I think the properties proposed are in proportion. While it is a shame that you lose sort of linear aspect of this settlement, for want of a better word, there are many examples throughout Perth and Kinross of this sort of slow, gradual development. I think the houses themselves are in proportion to the other houses in the settlement. I understand the current residents' opposition on the basis of overlook the residential amenity and overlooking the properties. But I think that's ameliorated or mitigated by the layout facing away from the houses. And I'm also interested to see how many garages and outbuildings are actually at the rear of the existing properties. So on balance, I'm in favour of this property, so I'm going to vote yes to let these houses go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Illingworth. We don't always agree in this local review body, and this is one occasion where I cannot agree with my colleagues. I see their point of view, but having visited the site just the other day, I was struck immediately at how the extent to which these other two houses clearly breach the existing pattern, and I think that I feel it would be an unfortunate precedent to allow this, although I realise that that's what's going to happen. But because I feel that although the houses themselves are similar to the ones that are there, I feel it's a clear breach of the existing linear pattern, and I would be prepared to support the officers on this occasion. I have to say also that perhaps any issues that they may have with the way it has been handled previously, it is not a matter for this review body to consider. But certainly, I think, Mr. Elliott, have our decision. It's 2-1 in favour of allowing this to go forward. I don't know if you wish to do any tidying up with Councillor Wilson as to the wording.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just kind of going through that. I think by majority 2-1, it would be grant subject to suitable conditions and informatives. And Councillor Wilson gave the justification. Basically, it's considered that it accords with the development plan, including the supplementary guidance, on the basis of basically it's an extension to a building group. And of course, the dissenting voice, if you like, is yourself, Convener, and I'm taking it basically that you're more or less in line with the reasons for refusal.
Yeah.
The only thing I want to do there is bring in Mr. Harrison, if I could, as to whether there's any need to discuss the conditions.
Thank you. The possible conditions you might wish to consider, which I think is referenced in the papers, is first of all the colour of the cladding, and also there's reference to stonework and whether or not you wish to have a sample panel of that or any samples of that submitted. I think I think it was yourself, Councillor Illingworth, mentioned the importance of landscaping. There's indicative landscaping shown in the drawings. Whether you'd wish to formalise that by asking for a landscaping plan in relation to the tree planting, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Both of the plots are, of course, significantly larger than the most of the plots fronting onto the road at present. I didn't know whether or not you thought there was any need or otherwise in relation to removal of permitted development rights, because again, I think Councillor Illingworth, you made reference to outbuildings at some point.
Yeah.
The only other thing that I think was touched upon was the shall we say the quality of the surfacing of the access to the application site. At the moment, it's as it were a gravel style path. Whether there's any need for any improvement to that in your mind. It wasn't asked for by the Roads Authority, but I think there was mention of that by some of the third parties.
I think I would prefer to see the road, certainly one of the roads, resurfaced in Tarmac Adam.
Well, the application site obviously has the eastern means of entry rather than the western as the most direct means of entry.
Yeah. And I think the developer said he would be happy to accept that condition.
Those are the only points I'd make.
So, Mr. Elliott, are you happy now? You have everything you require?
Yes, Convener, that's that dealt with.
And if I may just check that Councillor Wilson is happy as well.
Yes, I particularly want to ensure the two things I think Mr Harrison mentioned. One was the roads, and I'm happy to go along with what's been suggested, but I'm particularly keen to see a landscaping plan, because inevitably if there's new housing it always looks a bit stark to begin with, but a well thought out landscaping plan for both of the plots can help, not only help with amenity reasons and landscaping, but also biodiversity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Before we move on to the applicant, I'm sure they will be pleased with this outcome, and I would say to the objectors, I hope you at least recognise we've given this a very thorough examination and have been to have a look at the site as well. So, before we move on to item 4.2, colleagues, I understand that Mr Harrison may have a perceived conflict of interest in item 2, so I think with the assistance of officers, we will banish Mr Harrison and ensure that he does not take part in the next part of the meeting at all. So we will call you back, David, so don't go away.
Thank you very much.
So, Mr Williams, can we, for the minute, can we confirm that Mr Harrison has now gone and is not taking part in the meeting at all?
Yes, convener, I can confirm that Mr Harrison has left the meeting. Excuse me, has left the meeting.
Okay, thanks so much indeed, Danny. So we move now to item 2, colleagues, which is the a planning application for the erection of a dwelling house and change of use of former reservoir building to form ancillary accommodation, former water reservoir, Blairgowrie Road, Dunkeld. So may I ask you, Mr Elliott, to step up and introduce this item for review.
Thank you, convener. Yes, I will present this one. It is quite lengthy because of the complexity and a number of photographs. I will take my time and hopefully explain everything. Now, of course, members, you have a detailed planning permission is sought for the erection of a dwelling house at the former water reservoir, Blairgowrie Road, Dunkeld. There is an existing planning permission for the conversion and extension of the former reservoir building into a traditional pitched roof form. This proposal seeks to replace and relocate that permission with a new build house in a different orientation and a linear flat roof form. The proposed house would be some 20 metres from the reservoir building at its nearest and some 45 metres away at its most distant. The proposed single-storey house would be some 7 metres wide and 30 metres long, set in stilts, and is described as unashamedly contemporary. The walls would be clad in timber and the roof would have a green wildflower treatment. Now, if we could go on to the photographs, please. Now, members, you have plans for the proposal in the papers. The most useful to have before you when viewing the photographs are the plan on page 287. Which is for the proposal, site plan for the proposal, and to a lesser extent, the plan on page 285, which shows you the properties around. The photographs commence from the most westerly point of the site before proceeding into the site itself. Later on, there are views looking out of the site, and then we move on to views from the A923 Dunkeld to Blairgowrie Road and its relationship with the site. Now, before you have the first photograph. That's taken from the extreme western end of the site. If you look at page 287 of your papers, it's the pointed end of the site at the bottom of page 287. Now, the red lines mark the boundary of the site, and you'll see there's a path entry shown there as well. Now, the next photograph, if we could go on to that, it's taken a bit further in down the path you saw in the previous photograph. The building on the right is the neighbouring property Ty Greenich, or rather the outbuilding for that, or the secondary building, which is marked on the plan on page 285 of your papers. That gives you the orientation of where things are here. Now, in the photograph, the yellow line denotes the approximate position of the proposed building, and I do stress approximate position because of the nature of the site, the trees, was difficult to mark the precise position of the proposed house. Next photograph is taken a bit further down the path looking towards the former reservoir building. We mentioned that has its existing consent. The photograph after that, That moves to the right. You can just see the edge of the former reservoir building on the left and the approximate position of the proposed house coming in on the right. Next photograph sweeps around again to the right, and you'll see more of the approximate line of the proposed house. Bear in mind, it built into the hillside, it will be on stilts. Now, next one, you'll see the other end of the position of the proposed house can be seen. Next photograph. This is having moved further up the path, and this is taken back towards the original entry starting point, and that's the neighbouring property Ty Greenock, and its kind of outbuilding or secondary building that is marked there. Following photograph is from the same point, but it's taken, you're now looking northwards towards the former reservoir building, and you'll just see the approximate position of the house coming in there. Next photograph. Now this is stepping slightly up from the previous photograph and gives a better idea of the approximate position of the proposed house and the slope. And next one, again stepping up once more, looking back, again more northwards. Again, you have the proposed position of the house and its relationship with the former reservoir building is seen there. Next photograph. This time we've moved further up the slope again, and you can see the overhead line we leave when looking northwest down to Ty Greenock. And next photograph. This time the photograph shows a path which is out with the site, which you don't see any red lines for the boundary there, but this is looking out with the site. Now that path can be seen on page 285 of your papers as it heads towards the other properties to the south, Verenag and the Nuke. And next photograph after that, again this view is out with the site, this is further along the path, still on land within the applicant's control, and the property seen, I understand, is Verenag. Now, we change sequence of photographs now. The next sequence is photographs taken from the Blairgowrie to Dunkeld Road, and it may be helpful to have page 287 before you to understand where they're taken from. Now, this particular photograph is taken from just beyond the southeast corner of the site, nearest the road, and is looking north back up the road. And you'll see marked there additional trees potentially affected by the visibility display which is to the south of the proposed access. You don't see the proposed access, that's around the corner, but those trees are to the south of the proposed access. Next photograph. This next photograph is taken from the proposed access, looking south back towards where the previous photograph was taken. The easiest way to locate where this photograph is taken is to find the car on the bend in the road on your plan on page 287. That's where it's taken from. It's quite easily located, that one. That's where the proposed access is. Now moving round, still the same position but moving round, this photograph turns into the site and shows the proposed access and parking area and beyond the parking area. Next photograph. This view, again, moving around, this is a view from the same position of the proposed access, shows the road bending away westwards from the proposed access. So you're now looking round towards the bend, going round. Next one, we've come further round the bend on the road, and this is a view back into the site and the approximate position of the proposed house shown there from the road. Next photograph, we have a view of the former reservoir building from the road level. And finally, we actually come back to a previous photograph showing the position of the proposed house and the former reservoir building behind. That gives you the relationship. Now, members, turning to the applicant's case, the general background, detailed permission was granted for the conversion of the former reservoir building to a dwelling house in issued 2010, renewed roughly 2013. and subject to a further detailed permission in 2016, is therefore a significant material planning consideration in the assessment of this proposal. Now, this is the applicant's case, of course. It's emphasised by the applicant with reference to a previous legal case. The applicant is entitled to fall back on the existing consent for the conversion if the current proposal is not granted. Now, the proposal itself, the applicant wishes to, stated they want to revoke the existing permission and for the conversion and have this replaced with the current proposal to alter the location of the approval within the site. That is to replace the proposed conversion reservoir building with a new build dwelling in an alternative and more elevated position. Other benefits described for revising the development of a house on this land would include reducing the building footprint, the length of the driveway, the scale of the engineering option, and the potential risk from flooding, avoiding the need to waterproof the basement of the reservoir building, securing a more feasible build, and providing a better standard of occupation and outlook for the prospective occupants. The site and its surrounding have been the subject of a very detailed appraisal, including updated tree survey contained within the review papers. Now, the site is identified on the Ancient Woodland Inventory, and which acts as a provisional guide. The detailed tree survey of some 200 trees in one tree group where birch and sycamore predominate has been undertaken. The officer's view that there's mentioned as 63, it's mentioned as 63 and 73. The officer's view, according to the applicant, of 63 trees that would need to be felled is contested. The proposal would involve the felling of 39 trees, which is 2 less than the approved proposal. The marginal change in the quality of the trees affected by each proposal would be more than compensated for by the net gain in improving the biodiversity of the site. The site is currently assessed as having low ecological value despite the ancient woodland designation. The limited ecological value is partly due to the dominance of non-native beech and sycamore. It's envisaged the enhancement of biodiversity would be realised mainly through the proposed woodland management plan, the eradication of Rhododendron ponticum, and the investment in protection of trees from deer browsing. This assessment is supported by the findings of independent forestry and environmental consultants. Concern regarding trees was not raised at the pre-application stage. And the 10-year woodland management plan also provides for the planting of 280 trees, and none of these benefits would be achieved through the extant planning permission, which only provides for 30 new trees. In conclusion, the development is seen as having a net overall positive effect on the woodland, which is currently in an unfavourable condition. Consequently, the applicant contests the assessment that the proposal is contrary to LDP 2 Policy 40A and B, which seeks to protect and enhance woodland, and Policy 41, which seeks to protect wildlife and habitats. Undertaking the permission for the conversion, that is, due to a combination of more extensive engineering options, greater risk of flooding, limited tree planting is viewed as offering significantly less biodiversity benefit in the current proposal. The third reason for refusal refers to the proposal being contrary to LDP2 Policy 19 concerning housing in the countryside. Again, this concern was not raised during the pre-application discussions, where the sole consideration was the relocation of the house within the site. The planning officer accepted this proposal would move the house away from the area of significant flood risk. In conclusion, from the applicant's perspective, any impacts and policy considerations need to be balanced against the significant prospective benefits to the woodland that can only be secured through the current proposal. Members, turning now to the report of handling from the appointed officer, the site contains a former reservoir building that has planning permission to be converted and extended to form a dwelling. This new proposal from the new owner seeks consent for a new build house on higher grounds due to the flood risk associated with the permitted location. The applicant is willing to revoke the existing planning permission if consent is granted for this proposal. It is envisaged that the former reservoir building would then only be used for ancillary accommodation or purposes relating to the new built house. The applicant sees the proposal as offering benefits overall to the biodiversity of the woodland in terms of the impact of the development of future woodland management work. These proposals were discussed at a pre-application stage. At that time, consideration of the additional and comparable impact on trees, compliance with housing and countryside policies, and guidance and justification for the substitution of the planning permission were seen as the key issues. Although near Dunkeld, the site does not abut the settlement boundary, it lies adjacent to a building group to the west. The proposal is not assessed as being supported as an extension to that building group. The positioning of the proposed house within an area of woodland is viewed as manufacturing a residential plot requiring the removal of a significant number of trees, rather than constituting a definable site in accordance with the housing countryside guidance. Regarding the potential for flooding, the proposed relocation is understandable, with the level of risk at the former reservoir building being assessed as increasing since permission was granted in 2008. I think it was actually issued in 2010. The application was 2008. While the housing and countryside guidance recognise that there can be circumstances where existing houses are relocated due to flood risk, there is no similar provision for unimplemented permissions. In this case, accommodating such a relocation might be seen as a pragmatic approach, subject to the alternative site being suitable, the revocation of the existing permission and the establishment of a legal agreement for long-term woodland management. However, the guidance is clear that clearing woodland, I know there's two clears in there, the guidance about clearing woodland to create a site is not supported. It is noted that with the conversion permission, most of the tree removal related to the access for that permission. By contrast, the relocated house site would contain most of the trees to be removed under that proposal, not the access. The trees supplementary planning guidance and LDP2 policy 40A seeks to retain and protect trees, nascent woodland. As upland birch, the site is also a priority habitat. The conversion proposal would remove about 40 trees, mainly for access and village visibility displays. The proposal would remove about 39 trees for the access and the footprint of the house, and an additional 13 trees due to their condition. Potentially 11 further trees may require removal or lopping to secure the visibility displays. While the number of trees affected are broadly comparable, different trees are involved, and following more survey work undertaken by the applicant and detailed discussion, it is considered that the proposal would have significantly greater impact on the woodland. This development also raises the prospect of further tree removal to provide a more open outlook or safer residential environment for future occupants. The construction process may also result in further trees being lost. The applicant's willingness to enter into a legal agreement for woodland management is recognised and is being explored thoroughly. This is not seen as workable in practice, as providing a robust means of securing the long-term management of the woodland, especially as the current owner's aspirations may not be shared by future occupants and owners. A legal agreement would not overcome the officer's concern regarding the clearing of the woodland to provide a house plot, contrary to housing countryside guidance and LDP2 policy 40A and the associated policy 40B regarding the protection of woodland habitats. Regarding design members, moving on to design, when viewed in isolation from these considerations, the proposed house is seen as being of high quality, contemporary design and capable of being accommodated in its setting without having an adverse visual impact on the locality or the national scenic area. While there are a high number of objections, it is not assessed as raising direct overlooking or raising privacy issues or problems with light pollution, despite the extensive areas of grazing, the nearest property being some 60 metres away. It is noted that the proposed access visibility displays do not meet current standards, even with the removal or lopping of further trees and the impact on the bend is slowing traffic speeds. It is recognised that permission of an access is part of the existing planning permission, which is for, as we've said, the conversion of the former water reservoir building. Turning around to representation members, we have 14 letters of objections. The key issues raised in the objections are contrary to the development plan and housing countryside guide, loss of public footpath, concerned over vehicular access, loss of trees and impact on biodiversity, impact on visual amenity and the national scenic area and light pollution. Now there are 12 letters of support or emails of support. The key issues raised are that it enhances the character and environment and biodiversity of the area, economic development, quality of the design, improvements to access and public access provision. The local community council have offered support on the following grounds. Principle has already been established for a dwelling, improvement on existing permission in terms of visual impact, acceptable impact on trees and biodiversity, and the need for local homes. And lastly, members, just to round off, in this case, there has been no request for a site visit or a hearing. Thank you, members.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Elliott. Are there any questions for Mr. Elliott on this application for review? Councillor Illingworth. No, any questions from you, Councillor Illingworth?
I've got no questions at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wilson, any questions from you?
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Mr. Elliott, for giving us a very detailed report. I think in summary, this application is for a new house, as you said, I think on stilts, and it would, if it got consent, the applicant would agree to a revocation of their existing extant consent for conversion of the old reservoir property. Have I got that right?
Yes, Councillor Wilson. First component part is the proposal relocation, the new build. Now, within this, it is true, within this description of the application I'm talking about, it does refer to change of use of former reservoir building to form ancillary accommodation. Now, the papers from the applicant say that's no longer part of it, but that would need to be tidied up if consented. And yes, the applicant is also saying that the existing consent for the conversion of the reservoir building would be revoked. And of course, what would happen there is if permission was granted, then it wouldn't be issued until that revocation takes place.
Thank you.
Happy, Councillor Olsen?
Yes.
Yeah. I just have one question, Mr. Elliott. Perhaps if you could look at page 287, it's regarding the access. So if it's and the bit we indicated there's a car on the corner just where the access would be. Am I to understand that Roads colleagues are content with that access, assuming the visibility displays are improved? I'm a bit unclear on the view of Roads colleagues.
You are correct, and being around it's more subtle than that. You will see from page 263 the transport planning object to the proposed vehicular access on grounds of road safety, and you do have their consultation response. However, what the planning officer, the appointed officer, has done is taken into account that there already is a consent for a proposed access leading from that particular part of the road. So the officer has chosen not to object on those, to refuse on those grounds.
Right, I'm not sure that's clear things up for me, Mr. Elliott. So if I just perhaps just to be absolutely sure, so the access is not necessarily approved by Roads colleagues.
They have concerns. They have objected to it about not meeting the visibility display and on the bend. However, the officer has taken into account that there is an existing permission for the conversion of the water building that has an access that goes from that same area, and therefore that's a significant material consideration was taken into account, that it's already consented and it could be built in that area.
Right, I understand fully now, Mr. Elliott. Thank you very much for that explanation. I have no further questions. Colleagues, have anything else from you? We're both quite happy.
No further questions at this stage.
Right, so we now would consider a preliminary decision. So members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is the information contained within the papers and the presentation by Mr. Elliott, or do we require more information? Councillor Illingworth.
Yeah, I'd like to do a site visit, and I'd like to see a clear plan for the relocation of the footpath and I would like to see a bat survey conducted before we can make a final decision.
Right, Mr. Illingworth. Well, it's normal practice of this committee that if one of us requires a site visit, we agree and we will. Have you any further comment at this stage, Councillor Wilson? You're on mute again, Councillor Wilson, I'm afraid.
Double click. Councillor Illingworth has already made the points, I think, mainly. This is very complicated. I read the papers, which are voluminous, and my provisional conclusion on reading them was that it was a complicated application, and I think a visit to the site would aid our understanding. And in fairness, to look at all the issues, I think we need to look at the road access, the one you've drawn attention to, convener, because we've got a conflict of information from officers. The roads officer saying it's not safe, and the planner says I think it is safe, and that's something we need to look at on site. I think too the path issue, Councillor Illingworth's right, and the bat survey, and I think we need to get the confirmation of some of the requirements that are laid out. So I think a site visit would be particularly useful.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wilson. So I think, Mr. just we need to be absolutely clear of the purpose of the site visit. I would advise my colleagues also to wear a good pair of boots, would be my advice when I was there the other day. I think the only thing we would need to firm up is whether it is the three of us that do the visit. We would then have to all be available for the meeting to consider it, obviously, because we don't want to go back to people who asking for a visit and then somebody else undertaking it and making the decision. So I think it's important that the three of us participate in this. So that may affect the timing, Mr. Elliott. But are you clear of where we are?
I think I'll need to go through that. Yes, I understand what you're saying in terms of the site visit, but I think it's best to go through the terms of the deferral. Just to be quite clear, there is an issue to do with the bat survey, which I'll raise with you, that you may need a preliminary clarification before you get a bat survey. But first of all, what member, I'm assuming it would be an unaccompanied site visit.
Yeah.
Normally they're unaccompanied. Secondly, mention of the path. Now, yes, the applicant, in the papers, the applicant has said that the path that the public use can be rerouted. But my understanding, I haven't seen any plan in the papers for that. I don't know what members think, but it'd be something like defer for plans to be produced by the applicants, of course, to show the rerouting of the path on site or used by the public. Shall we say the main path, the main path on site used by the public? I think it's obvious, it is marked on the plans. And it's a matter for you members, but how that rerouting, and it's hopefully shown the plans, may affect existing trees. And how it will be delivered. Because of course it's not just a line on a map, you have to see how it will be delivered in the circumstances. I did note, members, that there's to be a suggestion of a deer perimeter fence. So the delivery would be how it would be delivered, including any gates or such like required through the suggested deer perimeter fence. Does that cover things for the path members? Yeah.
Yeah.
Nodding heads.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, in terms of the bat survey, members, a bat survey, as you'll have seen from the ecological study, and I know this anyway, a proper bat survey is carried out between May and September. Now we are getting close to the end of that period. It's quite possible that the experts that carry out the bat surveys are so busy that it might not be possible to prepare one. So it's possible that would delay it until next year. However, I'm going to point something out to you. If I can find it, the ecological survey does make clear that there's no bat survey being carried out. However, I noted comments from the Tree and Biodiversity Officer. Page 421 it is in your papers. Sorry, page 422. Now this was done before the ecological survey was carried out and before the appointed officer took a decision. But it talks about, during the visit, I noted that the stone building with slate roof has features that could be used by bats. The building's position in Woodland and next to a water course means a bat survey undertaken by a qualified ecologist is required to determine the actual or potential presence of bats in line with the Bat Survey Guidance 2018. No assessment impact on development bats was submitted. Now that is true because the ecological survey says that. However, the appointed officer didn't make an issue of this in refusing the application. And the stone building, of course, it will be the water building conversion and has its consent. And as we've just been discussing, if this proposed building is consented, the intention is to revoke that consent, so there's no works on the stone building. So I'm now unclear as to whether a bat survey would be required in those circumstances. So members, it might be more beneficial to have it clarified from the Tree and Biodiversity Officer as to whether that bat survey is required before actually requesting one. As I say, there's a possibility it might not be available. If one is required, it might not be available until next year. So maybe it's better to, subject to your own thoughts, as to obtain clarification from the Tree and Biodiversity Officer whether a bat survey is required, where that stone building referred to is in her consultation response of 1st September has its own planning permission, and the applicant is offering to have that permission revoked and therefore no works carried out on that. I appreciate that's quite complicated, but I think what I'm saying, members, is although you've asked for a bat survey, I'm not 100% sure one is required, and maybe that needs to be clarified first of all.
Yeah, I think, Mr. That's a good point. We don't want to be asking for something that's not a requirement, so I think we need to have two aspects to that clarification. One is when it is whether we do require one, and then also in terms of the timing of when we do it.
Can I make an apology? My computer has gone down, so I've had to use another machine. Mr. Elliott was describing the need for a bat survey and whether it was whether it was necessary. Could we go back to that, please?
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Illingworth, I did notice your screen flicker a little bit there. Yeah. It's helpful that you've said you've had to switch screens. I'll recap is what I pointed out. Both yourself and Councillor Wilson referred to requesting a bat survey. What I've said is if you look at the, we know there's no bat survey, the ecological study says that. But if you look at the consultation response from the Tree and Biodiversity Officer, page 421, especially 422, there is a clear mention about a stone building, could be bats, and an assessment is required, and none has been submitted. Now that's true, we've had that confirmed. But what I pointed out is the stone building is the former water reservoir building that has planning permission already for conversion. And also the applicant is offering to revoke that permission, so no work should actually be carried out there. So in my mind, there's some doubt as to whether in this application for a proposed new build, in those circumstances, whether a bat survey is actually needed. And I'm also pointing out that bat surveys, as is said in the ecological study, are carried out May to September, and we're getting towards the end of that. There's a possibility the applicants won't be able to get an expert to do that by September, which would mean you would have to wait to next year to get that survey. Now that does happen in other, I'm aware of that happening in other applications, but perhaps what needs to be firstly done is clarify whether a bat survey is needed in the first place. Now, if one is required, you do need that for determination. But we maybe need to clarify from the Tree and Biodiversity Officer, do we actually need one in the circumstances?
Right. Okay, happy with that now, Councillor Illingworth?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Thank you. Thank you for recapping. Many apologies.
Sorry, Convener, just to go back, just to recap, we have 3 reasons for deferral, and I'm going to paraphrase for obvious reasons. Unaccompanied site visit, plans to be provided by the applicants in terms of the path on site and rerouting. Now, do you, just thinking of that, do you wish for community green space or the appointed development management to be given the opportunity to comment on those plans?
I think that would be very helpful.
Yes.
And also, thirdly, as we were just discussing, clarification from the Tree and Biodiversity Officer whether a bat survey is required in the circumstances. We'll put that in longer hand later on, but that's the reason. Are there any other reasons for deferral?
I wonder, Convener, thanks Mr. Elliott for your thoroughness as ever, but do we know if the applicant is willing to revoke their existing consent, what their intentions are to do with the reservoir building? Just leave it alone or use it for another purpose or whatever? It might be interesting to find out what their intentions are, because it does affect the bat survey thing. If there's no alterations to be made, then presumably the bats that are doing whatever bats do in the building can carry on and do it without let or hindrance. But if there was any other plans to do something about it, then it might affect the bat survey. But also, I'm cautious about always letting one application go and thinking of approving another one until we know what the intentions are. Because if it was fit to be converted to a house, it would still be fit to be converted to a house. Maybe there's an issue about the flooding, to get clarification of the degree of flood risk to the old property, because that was given as a main reason for relocation. I don't want to extend the list, Mr. Elliott, but if we're doing a deferral, let's do a belt and braces exercise.
To answer your question on the revocation, I'll put it slightly differently. As I said earlier on, that the description in the application refers not only to the erection of the proposed dwelling, the new build, but also a change of use to ancillary accommodation. And yes, there is quite some discussion amongst the representations about that. But within your papers and within the early part of your papers, the review presentation, it is clearly stated that that's no longer required. No longer sought. I don't have the precise wording, but they do agree to a revocation. That no longer being sought, so there wouldn't be a request for change of use to ancillary, so that's gone. They're also agreeing to a revocation of the existing permission. So essentially where that takes you, and this is the answer I think, is that reservoir building stays as it is and there's nothing there. You would have nothing before you in terms of the reservoir building. So I think that's the answer to that. In terms of flood risk, that might be difficult to provide the information, but my reading of the report to handling is that it's as much a change in the assessment of the flood risk, which is the problem here. And as we all know, the climate change and the increased level you give to the flood risk. So therefore that indicates why there was consent previously, but the assessment now changes and that causes the problem. So I don't know if you would be able to get more information to kind of confirm that any further.
Okay, I'm content with that, thanks.
Now, Councillor Illingworth, you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, it's to go back to the bat issue. If there is found to be a bat issue, the mitigation is relatively simple, isn't it? It's just a matter of putting in some bat boxes. Is that the case?
That would really depend on the nature of the bat survey, because obviously the officer, the Tree and Biodiversity Officer, is referring to the stone building, the former water reservoir building. If that's looked at closely, you know, as you saw in the photographs, there's one side of the roof is open. Then I really couldn't say. Yes, there is. That's in relation to if it's looked at in relation to the stone building. We're kind of, in a sense, you're getting too far ahead. You need the survey to be carried. If a survey is required,
yeah,
you need that to be carried out. It would then suggest any mitigation measures. You're quite correct about reference to back boxes. That would be more likely in relation to the new build than the conversion. Can't be certain on that, but in a sense, you're going too far forward.
right.
And you must first establish if a back survey is required, and if it is required, it will look at what it needs to look at and come up with mitigation measures if required.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you. So,
are you quite clear now, Mr. Elliott, here? Because if so, I have a couple of points of clarification, if I may, from you. Firstly, can I just clarify that a temporary loss of Councillor Illingworth for the changed machines does not affect our decision-making process here? We're not making a final decision, we are deferring, but can we just have, basically for the minute, can we have that clarification?
2 points to that, Convener. First of all, yes, you are making a preliminary decision to defer. You're not making a decision on the application. And secondly, even though it is still a decision at the end of the day, what we did is Councillor Illingworth fairly and openly said that he had an interruption, and we recapped and went through the bits he had missed. So therefore, we have covered everything, and therefore he has, you know, the full information before him to take that preliminary decision. So we are covered in that respect.
That's fine. I think, Mr. Williams, if we can ensure that the minute does show that, or some words to that effect. And a second point, just to be absolutely clear, when this comes back to us, whenever that may be, or comes back to the local review body, maybe not us, can we be clear that any reference to the change of use of the former reservoir building to form ancillary accommodation, as it says in the application just now, will have been removed to avoid any confusion?
I'm not sure we are able to do that, Convener. That is, if you like, the validated description in the permission application. But what can be done, it's obviously, it is an issue that, as I've said, would, if you grant it, could be dealt with on a grant to make quite clear that is not part of any permission that's granted.
So on that basis, I'm quite happy with that, college. Yeah. I think we're all confirmed.
Sorry, yes, members, that's deferred for the 3 reasons outlined: the unaccompanied site visit, the plans in relation to the rerouting of the path, and of course clarification as to whether a back survey is required.
That's fine, Mr. Elliott. Thank you very much, and we will look at who's going to be doing it once the information is to hand.
Well, did we not provisionally agree, Convener, that the 3 of us would go?
Oh yes, but I think we need to get some of this information before we go, Councillor Wilson, I think, so that we're not having to go more than once, I would suggest.
Absolutely, but it might be useful if we can, Mr. Elliott's good offices could expedite the information so that we can go reasonably soon.
Well, absolutely, because I think it was an issue in the past where people asked for site visits and then other people went and did them, and there was an element of perhaps confusion there. But we don't want to have that, so make sure it is the 3 of us when it is convenient.
I think, Convener, we will note the comments. We don't normally be that prescriptive, yeah. But certainly, yes, there are those issues, and I can see the sense in we could actually switch the narration so the site visit comes last. So you have the information before the site visit. I
think that would be best. So
yeah, excuse me, Convener, sorry, yeah, it would be normal practice anyway that we'd wait for the say there was several terms deferral, we would wait until everything else, all the other further requested information has come in before looking at the site visit anyway. So, and that's just a process we'll take on, but as Mr. Elliott says, we've noted your comments there.
Yes, and we'll leave the tricky aspect of getting 3 of us to agree to be available at the same time to you, Mr. Williams. Right. Thanks. Now, I think, colleagues, given the time, I propose that we have a short break, which will give Mr. Williams and Audrey an opportunity to get Mr. Harrison back in the meeting. So I propose that we have a short break now until 12 o'clock, and then we'll continue with the rest of the business. So We'll see you all in about 15 minutes, which gives us an opportunity to get Mr. Harrison back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just check, colleagues, that we're all there? Councillor Lingworth and Councillor Wilson? We can see that you've rejoined us, Mr. Harrison, so welcome back.
Thank you.
Just check again, Councillor Wilson and Councillor Lingworth, are you back with us?
Yep.
May I ask you, Audrey, can you confirm if my fellow councillors are there?
I can, yes, they are both there.
They are both there now, so we're ready to restart then. So Mr. Harrison safely back with us. We will now move to the next item, which is item 4.3, which is a planning application for the erection of a dwelling house on land 50 metres east of Mill of Muckley Farm Cottage, Dunkeld. So will you please introduce this application for review, Mr. Harrison?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, it's a detailed planning application for the erection of a dwelling house at Plot 1, Mill of Muckley by Dunkeld. We might go straight to the photographs, and you might like to have pages 5, 4, 7 onwards, providing you with the location plan, site plan, and of course drawings of the proposed house. The general sequence of the photographs will be the original building, as you see in the first photograph here, the site, that's plot number 1, and the relationship with the new build, that's on plots numbers 2 and 3. So I say in the first photograph here we have the, what you might say, the original farmhouse cottage building, and that, as you say, you'll see on the location plan. The general sequence of the photographs now will swing slightly towards the left. So if we move to the next photograph, we're just catching the corner of the cottage building, but also the beginnings of the adjoining steading buildings. As you can see, both of these are effectively single-storey pitched roofed properties, and you can probably also just make out, as it were, in the further distance, the beginnings of the erection of plot number 3, which I say you'll see in later photographs. So again, swinging slightly to the left of that photograph, see we're catching the corner of the steading building, but also beginning to pick up on plot number 1 itself, which of course is on that eastern side of the steading buildings. Again, slightly swinging towards the left of that photograph and stepping up into the site a little bit. We have the steading buildings, or the gable of the steading buildings, and of course the projecting element of it as well. You see the roof sloping towards you there. But we're also seeing the application site, or part of the application site, in plot number 1. And we're now beginning to pick up the roofs of plot number 2 house, which is substantially complete. Again, moving slightly towards the left of that photograph, We still see in the far distance plot number 2 house, but we see more of the application site, and we're starting to pick up on the couple of trees within the application site as well at the same time. And again, moving slightly to the left of that photograph and stepping back a little bit up the slope from the application site, you see the main body of the application site. And just to be clear, the more substantial tree, shall we say, in the immediate foreground is out with the application site. It's the trees and the bush beyond that are within the application site. But to say, you can see on the right-hand side of the photograph, we're looking now down more onto the roofs of the back of the outbuildings, the steading buildings, you should say, and then say more on the left-hand side of the photograph, you can maybe just see through to plot number 2. So moving on from that, we see the steading buildings looking slightly more at an angle this time. There's reference in the papers to ash trees within the site, and the fact that the ash trees are suffering from dieback at the moment, and I think this photograph probably confirms that. But I say we're looking past that ash tree, and you can probably just make out the structure of plot number 3 of the property there. But of course we have the outbuildings as well of the original steading as well in this photograph. So from there we swing slightly to the left again, and we're looking down the remainder of the plot number 1, and it's shall we say, how it relates to the adjoining farmland in this photograph. Moving on from that, we move down that boundary, that eastern boundary, say to the furthest southeastern corner of the plot, and as you can see, it's abutting plot number 2 in this instance, and you can see the roof of plot number 2, the property that is substantially complete, and the fairly extensive garden ground associated with the rear of that property. So if we swing slightly to the right of that photograph, we see the bulk of plot number 2 property. See, as you can get the impression that the land is falling away as we move towards plot number 2. And I say beyond that, I say you can make out hopefully the structure of plot number 3, which is in the process of being constructed. Swinging slightly to the right of that photograph, or moving to the right of that photograph, we're now looking back towards the cottage building which we saw in the first photographs, and of course the back of the steading buildings. This is now looking across plot number 1, or the lower area of plot number 1. But we're still catching a little bit of plot number 3, the structure of it, that is, at the extreme left-hand side of the photograph. Swinging round to the right of that again, we're now looking up the site towards the steading buildings, and you would be picking up the trees which we saw in the earlier photographs as well. See the sequence swinging towards the right here. As you can see, the ground's rising a bit. Again, we swing round to the right. We're looking up that boundary with the adjoining farmland. If we can maybe go back to the previous photograph. Thank you. As you can see that it slopes up towards some woodland at a higher level, so we see to the back of the application site. Swinging round again into the next photograph towards the right, we're looking up the ditch, which you can see on the plans, and that gives you an impression of the more open nature of the countryside there. Swing round again to the right of that photograph. It takes us right back into the application site. There's reference in the papers to the relationship between a balcony within plot number 1 facing towards the gable of plot number 2. And this is taken effectively from the position, albeit at ground level, that would be the sort of distance between these two properties. Swinging round to the right of that, in the next photograph, just to give you a little more detail, this is of course the structure I mentioned earlier, the erection of house plot number 3. So moving from there, we go in the next photographs through the gap. So this is now looking up the application site, as it were, up the slope slightly. On the right-hand side of the photograph, we've just got the gable of plot number 2, and on the left-hand side, some of the structure of plot number 3, and as it were, through the centre of that, beyond that, indicated by the red line, we have the approximate position of plot number 1. So we'll move to the next photograph. I'll just leave you with that general photograph of the application site. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case. Through a sequence of planning applications since 2016, permission has been granted for 2 and then 3 detached houses at Millamuckley Steading. In this process, 2 previous designs have been approved. One house, that's plot 2, is nearing completion. This proposal is seen as a 1 3/4 storey house with extensive use of coombe ceilings at first floor level and not a 2-storey property. It will be finished externally in a combination of wet dash render, stone features and timber cladding, along with a natural slate roof. The previous proposal for plot 1 was withdrawn due to the officer's concerns regarding scale, orientation and alterations to the site boundary. In response, this proposal reduced the width of the house, realigned the building with the previous approval, and lowered the floor levels in a stepped manner. These alterations are considered to reduce the overall massing of the proposed house. The increase in the size of the site is seen as regularising the boundaries with the adjoining plot 2 and reflects the area affected by former farm buildings. The ridge level would be only some 300 millimetres higher, and the proposed house overall only some 1.5 metres higher than the house in plot number 2. The 18-metre separation between the proposed balcony and the house on plot number 2 is seen as sufficient to ensure adequate privacy. Comparison is made with the approved houses close by at Drumore Steading, which is seen as being of similar design and scale, being 1 3/4 stories in height. The proposed house, at some 7.6 metres, would have a ridge level only 280 millimetres higher than those houses. Similarly, houses at Craigerstrenton and at the nearby walled garden are of a considerably larger scale, use smooth render and have extensive areas of timber cladding. These are not seen as being in keeping with the area in comparison to this proposal. In conclusion, the officer's reasons for refusal concerning the scale, siting, design and impact on the amenity of the locality are seen as subjective. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling, planning permission was first given for the demolition of farm buildings and erection of 2 houses under Category 5 of the Housing in the Countryside Policy and Guidance. This then led to 3 plots loosely based on the site of the previous buildings. An original farmhouse and a cottage remain. One house is nearing completion and another is expected to commence shortly. 2 previous designs have been approved for the house in plot 1. A third design proposal was withdrawn following concerns regarding scale, siting and design. This proposal is for a 5-bedroom, 2-storey house. The footprint of the house has been enlarged and the application site increased in size from some 1,400 square metres to 1,950 square metres. The most recent approvals are characterised by low eaves, large roofs, with first floor accommodation being mainly within the roof space. This proposal is seen as departing from the design approach of those houses which are under construction, also departing from the previous approvals and the original steading and cottage buildings at this location. It has a rough L-shaped plan with an additional gable. These present elevations of some 23 and 24 metres in length, an increase of some 3 metres in each direction compared to the previous approval. The combined changes are viewed as resulting in a bulky appearance to the proposed house. The site is also set at a higher level than the rest of the site. While the orientation of the house has been aligned more sympathetically to the other buildings, its position has moved closer to existing trees and further from the main building group. The proposed first floor living accommodation and balcony down the south gable is also expected to have an adverse impact on the neighbouring property due to overlooking and loss of privacy to the side and rear garden. In conclusion, the siting and design of the proposal is seen as bearing little relationship with the original buildings or the new houses in this location, which sought to have a unified design and discrete group in the landscape. It is seen as having an excessive scale and massing in a prominent position on the edge of the building group. Also, the extensive area of white render is seen as unsympathetic to the building group. In this case, there are no representations. There is, however, both a request for a site visit and also a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. So, colleagues, are there any questions for officers in this application for review? Councillor Wilson.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks, Mr. Harrison. The existing buildings, the existing farm buildings, we've seen. If we go back, I think to almost to the first slide, it seemed that was that the farmhouse, Mr. Harrison?
I'll wait till we get to the slide.
That's it.
That one there, yes.
Yes, my understanding is that was the main farmhouse. Yes.
Right. Do we know what's intended for that building, because it's in some state of decay? Yeah.
Yes, clearly it is. I have to say I don't know what is intended for the future for that building, if there is an intention to reuse it or otherwise.
Okay. Now, if we go on to it just said cottage building, but it's old farmhouse. I understand that. If we go on to the other ones, that says steading building, but it looks like a cottage to me.
There is a there is a cottage there, but I think there is also accommodation in, shall we say, more steading accommodation in part of it as well.
Tagged onto it, yeah,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. How far away, and I can nearly see this, but the red line is the part of plot 1. How far away is the edge of plot 1 from that wee cottage?
I'll maybe just scale it off the drawing, it might be better. Effectively at the nearest point, because of course there is a gable presented in the L-shaped form towards it. The nearest point is about 10 metres, and the remainder of it is probably a further 11 or 12 metres from it, so about 20 metres for the other L part of the plan. If you look on page 548, that may assist you.
Right. Okay. I'll do that. The cottage part of the steading building, is that habitable, and is it occupied?
I didn't see it, shall we say, being occupied when I was there. So I have to say I can't confirm really one way or another. It may just simply been that the people weren't present.
Okay, so we don't know. And there's another cottage building? I'm looking at the overall plans for the site as we're speaking, but and I think I can identify most of the buildings that are there, but I'm just trying to relate the plan in front of me with the photographs, and I understand the location of the understand fully the location of the house that's under construction and the one that's nearly finished, and the cottage. So so there's a wee yellow arrow here going down to cottage, and is that
that's effectively, I'm sorry if that was confusing, that's effectively the building you saw in the very first photograph.
Right. Okay, and the bit to the right is a steering building that's associated with that.
Yes, and you can see there's sort of two elements to that end of it. Yes. Yeah,
right. Okay, and apart from the semi-derelict farmhouse, is there another cottage building, or have we been round them all?
I think hopefully you've been round them all. Yes, there are no other original buildings.
Thank you. Convener, thanks for your patience. I just wanted to relate the plans to the photographs.
Right. It might be helpful, Councillor Wilson, that certainly when I was there, there was definitely people living in the cottage with the bit built on the side of it there, the cottage on the right-hand side. There was definitely residents on the occasion I was there.
Thank you.
So is that all your questions, Councillor Wilson?
For the moment, thank you. Yeah.
Right. So, Councillor Illingworth, have you any questions of officers?
Yeah. Can I just get confirmation of two things? Were there any objections to this application?
No, there were no representations from third parties. No.
And I've forgotten the second question, so I'll just leave it.
Oh,
okay. Right, thank you.
That's you for the moment, Councillor Illingworth. Yep. Right. Well, I have just one question, Mr. Harrison, if I may. I gather from the applications that these new build houses, as it were supposed to bear some relation to the existing buildings. Could you give us an idea in terms of scale how much bigger this proposed house is than the adjoining cottage?
Well, essentially, the photograph you see here, if you're talking about the steading building as opposed to the cottage, I tried to draw some distinction between the two, but I appreciate it does have a dwelling within it. They're all, shall we say, traditional single-storey buildings as such. I can only draw your attention to, let's see, if we look at page, 550 or 551, they may help you to give you an impression of the difference in massing between the two. The plot 2, as you can see, is on rising ground in comparison to the original steading buildings, which are set that bit lower. And I think I mentioned during the course of this, there's about a 1.5 metre difference in levels in broad terms between plot 1 and the house you saw on plot 2. So that hopefully gives you an indication of the differences between the two. Clearly, the proposal is significantly larger, being well, you could either say a 1 3/4 or a 2-storey property. That's for you to decide which you feel it is. But essentially, the steading buildings are the original steading buildings are effectively single-storey by comparison. So that would be, shall we say, my main comment on it.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Harrison. So I have no further questions. So if we're all content, colleagues, we can move towards a preliminary decision. So members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Wilson.
Thanks, Convener. Well, on reading the papers, my initial thought was perhaps this merited a site visit, but having looked at the photographs and related them to the plans, I think I'm content now that we have sufficient information to proceed to decision, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Illingworth, are you happy to proceed?
I'm happy to proceed.
Yes, I too, colleagues, are happy to proceed. So we will assess the case and move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor Wilson, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us up?
Thanks, convener. In this instance, the information provided by the applicant, particularly the detailed plans and elevations, I think have been very helpful, linked with the photographs that we've seen and the report that Mr. Harrison has been given to make a view on this. I think the proposed house, we're not arguing about the principle of a house, we're arguing about the scale, mass and design of the house, is disappointing in comparison to the house that's under construction, the one that's nearly finished. I cannot comment on the other one, but I think it's of a like, from the framework that we saw, as a like mind. And I think it looks heavy and quite, I'm not sure what the right word is, but it certainly doesn't seem to fit into the scope or the scene that we see before us of the old buildings and the very obviously modern buildings, but that have I think a degree of, they're fairly substantial buildings, but the degree of delicacy about them, I think, that seems to be lacking in the design of the one we've got before us. And I was disappointed in that, because I thought maybe this would be just a way of complementing. I think the height of the actual solum, as we'd see this building dominating the steading building and the cottage to a fair degree. And also I think it looks a bit incongruous in contrast to the rather finer design of the one that we already see. So I'm reluctant in a way, but I'm reluctantly going to go for supporting the report of handling on this one because of the scale, massing and design of what we see.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Illingworth, may we have your view?
Yep. Been lots of interesting points of view expressed in this paper, and lots of information provided to us. The site of this building is slightly above the rest of the environment, so anything you put on that site is going to dominate. Now, there already is permission for a house on that site, so I think the debate is all around. It's not an objective. Every decision is going to be subjective. I personally don't think the design of this has any objection to me personally. I think it's a good design. I think there's a variety of different buildings around that situation of different sizes. I don't think it will dominate. I don't think it will. I don't think it will cause any issue. But compared to the existing permission already, so I am in favour of this building going ahead as it is.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Illingworth. My view, colleagues, I have to say, first of all, I was struck when I visited the site at how much development construction is going on up what struck me, I thought, was a very small country road, but in fact it was quite busy with construction traffic and a lot going on. It was very helpful, I think, in helping to determine what my view was, that the adjoining house was nearly finished. And I have to say, when you see it, I would agree with Councillor Wilson's assessment of the house that's already been built. It seems to me to fit in reasonably well, although it is still a new build in the countryside. I think there is no doubt in my mind that this proposal is simply too big. I think the scale and massing is too great, and I think that a more appropriate design on this site could be found. So on this occasion, although we don't all agree, Councillor Wilson and I do, so I think, Mr. Elliott, if you're happy with this, I think that Councillor Wilson and I are in favour of upholding the review, but I'll leave it to you to do any tidying up you feel is necessary.
Convener, given that that's the majority I didn't want to articulate any thoughts I had on the reasons for refusal, but given that we've got a 2-1 vote, on page 535, I would suggest that line 1 and reason for refusal 1 should read, the proposal is contrary to policies 1A and 1B, and then a small b and small c after 1B. And the reasons, and I take some of what Councillor Lerman has said, by the way. I'm listening carefully to what he said, although we disagree, we can still listen carefully to each other. I would say that the proposal, by virtue of its scale and massing, right, not the design, but or so much the finish, but the scale and massing would be incongruous when viewed against the traditional existing structures. So we take out the words design, material finish and siting, because we know where the house is going to be sited, right? That's it. And then under reason number 2, the proposal is contrary to the Council's housing in the countryside supplementary guidance, not guide, but the countryside supplementary guidance, and fails to satisfactorily comply with successful sustainable place categories 1 and 3, but not 4. I hope Mr. Elliott's keeping up with these detailed comments, and again we've got the proposal by virtue of its scale, layout, design. I would say the scale and massing are the ones that we want to see. The scale and massing, the take out layout and design and material finish does not integrate well with its setting.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Although I agree with most of what you say, I'm not sure about the design, because it has been designed to be a much bigger building. I don't know if Mr. Elliott can give us any guidance on that.
Okay, I hadn't quite finished, convener.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Allow me very quickly.
I
know time's moved on. Reason number 3, the proposed development will adversely affect the residential amenity of neighbouring property due to overlooking, and that could be property number 2. That's plot 2. But that's for us to decide, and you're right, convener, right, the challenge. I would give way to you on the point of design, by the way, just to save us having a 5-minute debate about that.
So thank you very much indeed, Councillor Sophia. If you concluded your remarks, we'll go back to Mr.
I have,
Elliott.
convener. I will now go mute.
We'll go back to you, Mr. Elliott, and just check that you have everything that you require.
Yes, convener, just to recap, might be easiest just to describe the changes, but in ground 1, it's saying the proposal is contrary to policies 1A, 1B, B and C. Then it's the reasons given, the proposal by virtue of its design, scale and massing. So we're dropping out material finishing and siting. Then ground 2, you of course on line 2, it's countryside supplementary guidance. Yeah, later on, where it's successful sustainable place, it's only categories 1 and 3, you drop out 4. Then the line below, the reasons, it's again similar to ground 1, the proposal by virtue of its design, scale and massing does not integrate well. And the last one, ground 3, where if I've heard correctly, Councillor Wilson, adversely affect the residential amenity of neighbouring property, and then maybe put in brackets no to, close brackets, due to overlooking. I think that Councillor Wilson seems to be nodding his head.
So you're content with that, Mr. Elliott? That we have agreed a 2-1. I realise the applicant may not agree with this, but at least there will be a house of some description here in future, no doubt. And we've given it a very thorough examination. So we'll now move on, colleagues, if we may, to item 4.4, which is a review of condition 1 of planning permission for the change of use from office class 2 to hot food takeaway to 176 to 178 South Street, Perth. May I ask you, Mr. Harrison, to present this item for review?
Yes, thank you, Convener. As you say, the review concerns a detailed planning application for the change of use from office class 2 to hot food takeaway at 176 to 178 South Street in Perth. Planning permission was granted for this proposal in April 2021. This review solely concerns the requirements of condition 1, and that states permission is hereby granted for a limited period until the 31st of the 6th, 2023. The reason given for that condition was in view of the nature of the proposed development and to enable the planning authority to review the circumstances pertaining to the proposal within a reasonable time. I'll just take you through the photographs now. You might out to page 579 onwards, which will provide you with location, site plans, and obviously a layout of the premises. The general sequence of the photographs will be the frontage elevation onto South Street, then the pend, then the rear elevation, and then the chimneys as seen from Scott Street, that's the adjoining street. So as I say, in this first photograph, this is us looking at the frontage onto South Street with obviously the application site itself identified in red. As you can see, there are residential flats immediately above the property on both sides. Moving on from there to the next photograph, this is us moving into the pend that I'm sure you saw in the first photograph on the left-hand side. This is a pend which serves not just the premises that are subject to the application, but also the flats above. So if we go in that position down the pend through to the back of the property now, we can see the rear access door which serves the premises on the ground floor, but also you can see stairs serving the flats above. As you can see, it's a fairly tight application site in that sense. And if we move to the next photograph, it's really just to draw your attention to what I think is an air conditioning unit, which would appear, and I stress appear, to be actually related to the office premises historically, but is actually out with the application site. Moving on from that into the next photograph, we now look from that level to the entrances to the flats above, and immediately, I say, immediately above the application site. And these are the flats on that, shall we say, the western side. And if we swing round towards the right, in the next photograph, we look at the flats on the eastern side, also served from the pend. From there, we move into the adjoining street. You see the back of the properties again. This is us standing in Scott Street. And the reason for giving you this photograph is there's of course reference to the ventilation being provided, this time internally up through the chimney and vented out through the top of the building. So that's just to show you that the chimneys as well. So if we move to the next photograph, I'll just leave you with that frontage. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, the applicant has set out the estimated time programme to secure a building warrant and hot food takeaway licence, obtain a contractor, complete the works involved in fitting out the kitchen and premises and installing the ventilation duct and related soundproofing, and then to have them approved to a satisfactory condition. He concludes that the sequence of works necessary to enable the takeaway to be brought into use would only leave about 13 months for trading before the expiry of the planning permission in June 2023. Architects, planning and sound engineers fees have already been incurred along with the purchase of the property. The financial commitment involved in the change of use is identified as being approximately £50,000. Taken together, this assessment is seen as making the project unviable within the time period which is limited by condition 1. The applicant is seeking the removal of the condition. In that context, attention is drawn to the other conditions of the planning permission concerning sound reduction and hours of operation, which seek to safeguard the residential amenity of the flats and the area. These alone are seen as providing sufficient assurance to the council to control the potential impact of the proposal. It is further noted that the flats above provide short-term accommodation. There are numerous nightclubs, public houses and hot food takeaway shops in the immediate locality. Attention is also drawn to the number of vacant shops in the town and the prospect of the proposal providing work for up to 15 employees, in addition to the 15 employees presently working in hospitality for the company. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. The report of handling notes that the earlier planning application for this change of use was refused due to concerns regarding the potential impact on residential amenity and the conservation area, and the proposed external ventilation system on the listed building. This proposal now contains the ventilation system within the chimney flue and stack. A revised waste management strategy has been submitted. Local Development Plan 2 Policy 10 broadly supports the proposed use, as this will help to retain the vitality and viability of the town centre. Such support is subject to residential amenity being protected. The key consideration is protecting residential premises from cooking smells, noise from the operation of the ventilation system, and operational issues relating to food waste. In assessing the noise impact assessment submitted, Environmental Health noted that the assessment did not include access to the flat directly above the premises. Having assessed the type of extract fan proposed, they conclude that an induct silencer would be required and anti-vibration measures to control noise transmission within the building structure. It is recommended that these aspects be the subject of planning conditions. The officer concluded that, as the noise assessment was carried out at the third floor level of the property, there is the potential for noise disturbance on the lower levels, despite the recommended mitigation measures. An objector also questioned the quality of the proposed soundproofing. Consequently, it was considered that permission should be for a trial period to enable further assessment to be made and potentially for additional mitigation measures to be carried out if required. The proposal was considered to be satisfactory regarding parking, traffic safety, waste management and the conservation area considerations. There is a separate listed building consent for the proposal. Turning now to representations, there were 2 representations concerning noise, odour, fumes, vehicle and parking issues, waste. There are already ongoing issues of food waste in neighbouring premises. It's noted that there are no planning policies controlling the number of facilities for hot food takeaways within the town centre. In this case, there is neither a request for a site visit nor a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. And colleagues, are there any questions for officers on this application for review? Councillor Illingworth.
Yeah, can you explain the benefits of having a short-term condition, as in this application?
Well, in general terms, a temporary consent, if I can call it that in broad terms, allows the development to, as it were, to progress and, as it were, to test the circumstances in reality, as opposed to what is, shall we say, expected from the beginning. It allows for a degree of, shall we say, a greater degree of certainty from the council's point of view in the sense that it allows matters to be revisited to some degree at a later date, while it can be used in, say, in circumstances where, say, the degree of certainty is or uncertainty, I should maybe say, is quite broad, but it allows the principle at least to be well tested, and if necessary for measures to be added and through a later planning consent, and say a further application to be made, and the circumstances to be appraised at that time again.
Great, thank you, that's very helpful.
Is that you, Councillor Illingworth? That's fine. Councillor Wilson, have you any questions for officers?
Thanks, Convener. Yes, Mr. Harrison, the applicant has outlined the timeline for, and you outlined this in your summary, for doing the work, and explained to us his reasoning why the time would be very short for a trial operation. Do you think that the timelines that the applicant has given for all the different bits is optimistic, or over-optimistic, or pessimistic, or whatever professional language you like to put it? I think they're all realistic, but I'm just wondering if they're because they hit all the buttons for the heading. So if you can give us your thoughts and professional opinion on that, as a planner, not as a builder. Yes.
Indeed, yes. This is quite difficult. It's almost as difficult for me as I suspect for the applicant, because not all these things are completely within his control. It may be more difficult to get contractors to work at a time, or he may have access to people that I'm not aware of. So it's quite difficult to be prescriptive. If anything, I'd have thought his expectations of exactly how long everything is going to take. Some of these things might be run in parallel, but as I say, as they involve permissions from other people and dependency on other people to complete works in time or to sign things off in time, I suspect, if anything, his programme may be on the slightly optimistic side, judging from how fast some of these things sometimes progress despite good intent.
That helps me. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no questions for officers, so I think we can proceed to preliminary decision. So members, can we determine the application for review on the basis of information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Illingworth?
I require no more information.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson?
I'm content with what we have, thank you.
Thank you, and I too am happy to proceed. So we'll move to debate and assess the case. Can I ask you, Councillor Illingworth, having considered the applicant's papers, report of handling, Perth Kinross Local Development Plan, and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us off?
Firstly, the applicant suggests that the people living above the property are somewhat inferior because they're short-term itinerant workers. Well, I think short-term itinerant workers are as entitled to residential amenity as much as anybody in permanent accommodation. But having said that, I understand that the applicant wants understand the reasons why the applicant requires a longer time frame to get back the investment, and so I would be in favour of extending the permission up until 2026. I'd give another 3 years.
Thank you for that view, Councillor Illingworth. Councillor Wilson, do you have a view?
I would support that, convener. This wee bit of South Street has some history because the Pend is called, I think, Wesley Place, and was seen as linked with the Methodist Church, which is immediately behind of the flats. And my one plea, convener, in agreeing that an extension is given for practical reasons. And I think the applicant made a reasonable job of outlining the problems. Is that if we look at that picture, there's actually some lovely architecture there in the window fenestrations. If on the left, certainly, maybe less so on the right, but I would hope that the shop front, when it comes along, and it might be the subject of a separate application, bears some relationship to the architecture and history of the place. End of lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Wilson. I think on this occasion, Mr. Ellie, would like to know there is unanimity. I think I agree with Councillor Illingworth. I think a further 3 years to 2026 would be perfectly reasonable, and we have the comfort of revisiting the other conditions if necessary. So I think it's very fair and reasonable, especially given the uncertainty in the building industry at the moment, that we extend this to 2026. Mr. Elliott, are you quite happy? You have everything you require, Mr. Elliott?
Just one query, members, and I'm looking at the actual decision notice, page 575. I can get to it. Just to clarify precise date, at the moment the date is limited period until 31st June 2023. Are you wanting to extend that to 31st June 2026, or given this is August, is it 31st August 2026? Just, I know that's a 2-month difference. I just want to be clear what date is to go in there.
I mean, I defer to Councillor Illingworth. He was first, so we'll see what Councillor Illingworth has to say.
I would prefer June to August, but it's not a big deal.
Yeah, I think just a straightforward 2026 and leave it all the same.
Okay.
I think if you would agree, Councillor Wilson.
Yes, agreed.
So just, Commissioner, just to be clear, the review is allowed insofar as extending the condition 1 period, temporary permission period, to 31st June 2026.
Yes, Mr. Elliott, that's fine. That's
yes.
a straightforward decision for this one. Thank you. Right.
Yes.
Now, so we now move on, colleagues, to one that we have considered previously. We move on to application 5.1. Can I ask you, Mr. Harrison, to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, this is a detailed planning application for the erection of 2 houses at land north of Minnieburn Road, Arbroathven. The site is the corner of a field extending to some 0.25 hectares. It lies between a row of houses to the west, fields to the north and south, and Arbroathven beyond field track to the east. The plots would be generous. A central shared access is envisaged, and a footpath would be formed on the frontage. The houses would be single-storey with accommodation within the roof space. The walls would be finished in a combination of white stucco and vertical timber cladding, and the roofs would have a grey concrete tile. I'll just take you through the photographs to refresh your memory of your site visit, but you might like to have page 681 available by the location plan, site plan, and drawings of the houses. And you'll remember this is us approaching from Arbroathven, and then we'll see the farm track, the site from the Arbroathven side, and then the site from the houses on Minnieburn Road side. So I see in the first photograph here, we're at the entrance to Minnieburn Road, and this of course is where is the last house fronting onto the main road on that corner. So moving slightly to the left of that photograph, we start to look up Minnieburn Road towards the site. As you can see, the road is rising slightly, and you may just be able to make out the roof of the first property of the row of houses on Minnieburn Road beyond the application site on the extreme left-hand side of the photograph. So there we step up the road, as it were, and we look into the access track, the farm track, between the application site and then the immediately adjoining property, looking in from Minnieburn Road. And if there we step up the access track, just to let you see the extent of that. And as you can see, there are some entrances into the backs of houses served from the access track. And if we carry on up the farm track, a little bit. We can now look back down, as it were, to the Manyburn Road. And then you can see there's a fair difference in levels between the track and the adjoining agricultural land. So from there we move slightly towards the right of that photograph and up, as it were, onto the top of the embankment. So we're looking at onto that corner of the field as it is at the moment, which is part, of course, the southern part of the application site. We then swing round towards the right of that and look up the main stretch across the field towards the application site and the gable of the properties on Manyburn Road. So from that position down near the track, we move right up into Manyburn Road now, just to give you an illustration of the semi-detached properties fronting onto Manyburn Road there. It's an example of them. And then we move on from there, although we're just catching the corner of that last property. This is us looking down Manyburn Road towards Ruthven. You can just make out the roof of the first property we saw in the first photograph. From there we move slightly towards the left so that we can, as it were, step into the driveway of that last house, and this is us looking down, as it were, the frontage of the application site and the hedge encloses that onto Manyburn Road from that position. And then swinging slightly to the left of that, we look down the main body of the application site towards Ruthven. And again, swinging slightly to the left of that, we look past the application site towards the remainder of the field beyond. So from there, if we move towards the right, I'll just leave you with that general photograph of the application site. Turning now first in summary to the applicant's case. The two houses are envisaged for local growing families with local building businesses who have been unable to buy within their budget due to the high prices and the limited supply of housing in the area. The businesses employ 12 people and self-build is identified as the only way the families can remain in the locality. It is quoted that only 4 houses have come on the market at Ruthven in the last year. The local development plan makes no additional housing allocation at Ruthven following on from the development at Lonefoot Park. The site is seen as awkward to cultivate. It is viewed as not adjoining the settlement of Ruthven due to the presence of the 5-metre wide field track between the site and the settlement boundary as defined in the local development plan. Consequently, Policy 6, as quoted in the reasons for refusal.
Mr. Harrison, could I interrupt? But I just want to be clear, is Councillor Wilson still here? I thought he may have dropped off there.
Well,
It just be my screen, but is he still here?
Audrey, can you assure us that Councillor Wilson is still with us?
He dropped off my screen, convener, and
Yeah.
it looked like he's not in the participant list. I can see he's not there.
Yeah, excuse me, everyone. Just to clarify that, Councillor Wilson was actually just on the phone to me then. He's dropped out, so it might be a good idea to just pause proceedings for just for the time being. We'll try and get him back in.
Right. I think it'd be helpful, Mr. Williams, if we can identify when we lost him so that we can recap.
Yeah, no worries. I'm sure once we get him back in, he'll be able to help with that.
Mr. Williams, can I check with you that if we are unable to retrieve Councillor Wilson, can we postpone till the next meeting on the 14th of September?
Yes, that would be the procedure. Obviously, we want to, out of fairness, the applicants and really everyone involved, we probably want to give this a little bit of time, just to try and get Councillor Wilson back in.
Yes, I think we can be patient for a wee while, but
yeah,
Sorry, Danny, Convener, if I could come in there.
Yeah.
This is already a deferred one for site visit and information. Of course, the complication will be if it's deferred, and in theory we could have different councillors because you're not yet taken a decision. It's just a plenary decision so far for the deferral. But you either stick with the same 3 next time around having done the site visit, or you have to do the site visit all over again with different councillors.
I think, Mr. I think I see Councillor Wilson's face appearing on the screen.
Yeah, I see as well. Yeah.
That he's with us. Are you with us, Councillor Wilson?
Hi folks, multitasking. Audrey phoned me back to find if it got in. The screen froze about 4 minutes ago, and Mr. Harrison was about to say, and the case for the second part of his presentation, he was about to say that, and it chopped off, and that was where I left it. So I missed that bit, but I did hear all the rest of it.
Thank you for that reassurance, Councillor Wilson. Thank you. So, Mr. Harrison, are you happy that you know where to start again?
Yes, I think so. Thank you. And
Right.
if I don't pick it up correctly, please correct me, Councillor Wilson.
Okay. I'm sorry about that, guys, but given that this one's been around for a while, I think it's important we maybe try and complete it.
Absolutely, Councillor Wilson. Sure. On you go, Mr. Harrison.
Thank you, Convener. Turning now, therefore, in summary to the applicant's case. The 2 houses are envisaged for local growing families with local business, building businesses who have been unable to buy within their budget due to high prices and a limited supply of housing in the area. The businesses employ 12 people, and self-build is identified as the only way the families can remain in the locality. It is quoted that only 4 houses have come on the market in the last year at Aberystwyth. The local development plan makes no additional housing allocation in Aberystwyth, following on from the development of Lonefoot Park. The site is seen as awkward to cultivate. It is viewed as not adjoining the settlement of Aberystwyth due to the presence of a 5-metre wide field track between the site and the settlement boundary as defined in the local development plan. Consequently, Policy 6, as quoted in the reasons for refusal, is not considered to be a relevant policy. Instead, the proposal is seen as an extension of a building group to the east and is viewed as supported under the Housing in the Countryside Policy 19. It is seen as continuing the linear pattern of the building group, but not ribbon development. This is because the houses would share an access. It is also not seen as being an extension of the settlement due to the intervening track. The site is seen as definable with established boundaries on 3 sides. The officers view that the site adjoins and is visibly adjacent to Aberystwyth is viewed as relying on a subjective opinion. The applicant is willing to meet the contribution to the A9 junction improvement. The houses would have mains water and is expected to have private suds and septic tank drainage. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. The site lies out with a settlement boundary, and that is the settlement boundary of Aberystwyth, as defined through the local development plan process. The Housing in the Countryside Supplementary Guidance states that, I quote, proposals adjacent to and out with a settlement which has a defined boundary in the Local Development Plan 2 will be assessed under Policy 6, Settlement Boundaries, and not Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside. Close quotation. Local Development Plan Policy 6 states that development sites adjoining the defined boundary, settlement boundary, will only be acceptable where this concerns rural business or diversification, operational need, or a shortfall in housing land supply. None of these categories are seen as being met in this case. The applicant considers that the presence of the field track negates any consideration of Policy 6. However, the specific objective of the policy is to prevent the ad hoc, incremental and unplanned extension of settlements. Similar situations have been subject to proposals elsewhere, refused under Policy 6 and refused on appeal to the local review body. Additionally, in this case, the planning history of this site shows that outline plan permission was refused in 2007, and that refusal was subsequently dismissed on appeal to the Scottish Government. Regarding other considerations, the design of the proposed houses are seen as acceptable. However, the proposal would remove what is seen as a beneficial gap between the settlement and the group of houses on Manyburn Road. The proposal also takes the form of ribbon development, which is seen as being contrary to the Housing in the Countryside guidance. Access is acceptable and the site is capable of being connected to mains drainage. The personal circumstances of the applicant, while understood, are not considered to be of such significance as to justify a departure from the Local Development Plan policy in this case. In this case, there are no representations. However, there is additional information which you'll be aware of. This case, of course, was continued from the LRB meeting in May for a site visit and also for further information. The site visit has been undertaken. The further information is on page 719 onwards. In this, the agent has confirmed that the land was not put forward as a possible housing site through the Local Development Plan process, and that their experience suggests that that site might be too small to be considered in that context. They have also confirmed that there is mains drainage capacity, but further investigation is needed to establish a connection. There would remain to be a requirement to provide a SUDS drainage facility for the development. In addition, the planning officer has commented, and that's on page 721, and that explains that the overall strategy for towns and villages in the Strathearn area within the Local Development Plan was for further development to be contained within settlement boundaries, and there were no representations for additional housing land at Aberystwyth. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on this application for review? Councillor Wilson.
I've no further questions, having held the site visit, Convener. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Illingworth, have you any questions for officers?
Mr. Harrison mentioned that the plans involved septic tank or aseptic tanks rather than connection to the main sewage. But I understand, reading the papers that we just got, that they were currently investigating how to connect to the sewage. Is that correct?
Yes, I think I draw your attention to, shall we say, the most recent information on that, which is on page 719. I think this is a submission by the agent where they explain in the latter part of that, in response to the doubt between whether or not it was going to be a private drainage facility or there would be a link to the mains drainage, which you may remember was uncertain from the previous submissions,
Yep.
and they indicate that there is, first of all, there's physical capacity, having spoken to Scottish Water, but there seems to be a need for further investigation referred to there. And I think what they're really saying is, on the assumption that if planning permission was granted for the houses, that the further investigation would take place. And if it was found that it wasn't possible to link to mains drainage, they would provide a private system, but their desire and intention is to try and link it to mains drainage. There will still be a requirement for surface water to be dealt with through a SUDS process, though. The provision is only for foul drainage.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Harrison. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Illingworth. I have no further questions at this time, so I think we can consider a preliminary decision. So members, can we proceed to determine this application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do you require more information? Councillor Wilson.
I think we've got sufficient information to proceed, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Illingworth.
I'm happy to proceed.
Yes, as am I, colleagues. So we will assess the case and move to debate. So I'll start things off because, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross local development plan, and all other relevant material planning considerations, I am ready to begin. We've looked at this very carefully, colleagues. I've been to the site twice, and I think I am very mindful that we need to consider the papers before us and not consider what might have been had negotiations regarding the LDP being different. So therefore, despite all the applicants' papers that have been produced here, I am still not persuaded that there's enough to justify a departure from the LDP, and on that basis, I would suggest it's my belief that we need to uphold the reasons for refusal, simply on that basis. So I think that's my view. May we have your view, Councillor Wilson?
Thanks, convener. I take a contrary view, and the site visit was helpful. We spent quite a while there walking around the site and looking at it from all different aspects. This is a corner of a field, and my personal view, it might have been an applicant for a housing site in the LDP, but however, as you've said, convener, that isn't before us today. We have to decide if there is sufficient reason to depart from the planning officers. And I understand where the planning officers are coming from, because they have to comply fully with the LDP, and this is not an identified housing site. But in my view, it is a suitable site for housing. I think, although the size and style of the houses is different from the row of houses up Manyburn Road, it is a similar type of housing style and size to the houses that are immediately south or maybe southeast of the lane, where there's a variety of houses of fairly new construction and different shapes and sizes, but they're all modern, medium to large properties. So there isn't a huge difference in that regard. Yes, it is a departure from the local development plan, but I think given the contained nature of the site, because it's bounded by Manyburn Road, the lane and existing housing, so the only thing at the back of it is a field, and it isn't one of these instances, convener, where you think, right, somebody's going to apply it in another year's time for another wee bit and another wee bit, because it boxes off the field and tidies up the corner of the field rather than opens up another opportunity for an opportunity site, which is often the case with these things. So I would go with it. There'll need to be a set of the usual conditions. We'd like to see I think the plan is a joint access. We'd like to see as much of the boundary hedge kept as possible, or replaced with another type of hedge. I think if there is an opportunity for mains drainage to be used rather than a septic tank, then that opportunity should be taken. But I think that's in the gift of the applicant rather than our gift. There will be conditions about the timelines for starting and SUDs and landscaping, which I think the regular conditions should apply to this, and I would be in favour of allowing the application to proceed.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. And may we have your view, Councillor Illingworth?
Convener, sorry, could I interrupt at this? I don't normally interrupt at this stage, but I want to, and it will help Councillor Illingworth perhaps. Coming back to what Councillor Wilson said in his justification, he indicated it was contrary to development plan. I want to draw to Councillor Wilson's attention the terms of the LDP so we can be quite clear the justification you're providing. Policy 6 on settlement boundaries has been referred to. Development on sites that adjoin these settlement boundaries will only be permitted where the proposal, and then it gives categories where it is allowed. And that hasn't been mentioned. There's no, as I understand it, justification provided under those categories. So it appears on the face of it, unless you're indicating to the contrary, Councillor Wilson, that it's contrary to Policy 6. There's been suggestion by the applicant that actually Policy 6 isn't relevant, it's actually the Housing and Countryside Guide. And then you're looking at the categories which include building groups, which has been mentioned. But simply because, what I'm concerned about, Councillor Wilson, is simply because a site is self-contained, there's still a policy context to address there. I'm not convinced you did go into that policy context, because essentially what we have is Policy 6, which does, won't permit development adjoining settlement boundaries unless in certain categories. So you have to address that first of all, whether it's under that or not, and second of all, if it's not under that, you have to then address the Housing and Countryside policy, because then it puts it out with into that policy and whether it complies with that or not. And if it doesn't comply with that, I'm still not sure that simply because it's a contained site is enough justification to go against the Housing and Countryside policy. I appreciate it's unusual I do interrupt at this stage, but my concern is the step-by-step process and policy that would be helpful if Councillor Wilson addressed.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Mr. Elliott, for that clarification. Could we hear a bit more on the justification, Councillor Wilson, please?
Yes, you can, and I will repeat for the umpteenth time. If we had a copy of some of the more popular bits of the LDP beside us, it would be easier for us to articulate these points. Mr. Elliott is quite correct and quite right. He's absolutely doing his job to say, you need to justify your view, and I totally agree with him about that. The Housing and the Countryside policy allows certain conditions for this is not part of it's difficult to argue it's part of a building group because there are two building groups immediately adjacent, but this is the bit of land in between. So I think, Mr. Elliott, that's probably a tenuous reason for doing it. But Section 6, I think, allows some exceptions to the LDP, and I hope, convener, that you will speak to the convener of the planning committee and again ask for this guidance, because the last time at the planning committee I made exactly the same point. I'm sorry to bore everybody to death with it, but we need something beside us when we're working remotely. So Mr. Elliott, could you describe a wee bit more about what Section 6 says or doesn't say?
Well, there is Policy 6 and settlement boundaries.
Yes.
There's a Category 6 in the Housing and Countryside policy, but that's rural brownfield land.
Yeah,
and I'm not sure if that qualifies. What I can do, Councillor, you made comments on building group. My understanding is that my understanding is that, and I will come back on this, in terms of Housing Countryside and the building groups, of course, the settlement of our Broadbin is a settlement. So that is not considered a building group because it's a designated settlement. However, you do have a building group on, I think it's Manyburn Road, of a number of houses there, with more than 3 houses, so it qualifies as a building group. So the question then is, on that category, whether it's infill or extension. And it's difficult, my own view, difficult to see an infill because the infill would be with a Broadbent, which is a settlement in its own right. Now, come back on that. Back to policy 6 settlement boundaries. There are exceptions, that's correct. So do have the policy before me. What it reads is, for those settlements which have a boundary defined in the plan, built development will be contained within that boundary. Development on sites that adjoin these settlement boundaries will only be permitted where the proposal is A, in accordance with policy 8, rural business and diversification, and does not adjoin a principal settlement boundary. B, justifiable on the basis of a specific operational and locational need, and it can be demonstrated that there are no suitable sites available within the settlement boundary. Or C, required to address a shortfall in housing land supply in line with policy 24, maintaining an effective housing land supply. And D, will not result in adverse effects, either individually or in combination, on the integrity of a European designated site. The first question there, Councillor Wilson, is whether, and it is in the papers, this is the argument put forward by the applicant, the planning officer has considered that although there's a 5-metre track in between, that the site is adjoining a settlement boundary and the exceptions are not met. There's no argument being put forward that they are met, and therefore has considered it under policy 6, not policy 19 and the housing countryside guidance. So the first decision you have is whether it falls under policy 6. If it does, you then look at the exceptions. If you don't consider it falls under policy 6, then you look at the housing and countryside policy, and particularly the supplementary guidance, and we're talking about building groups there. As I say, I still have some concern. What you've currently articulated is simply, is that the site is defined, but then you really need to look at the policies.
I understand that, and thank you. Under 6, there is the one about operational need, and I think the applicants have made a reference to that. How strong that is difficult to tell from the information that we've got before us. So it may be that we need to go back to the housing and the countryside policy, and that the site is adjoining a settlement. I think that it qualifies for that, and I think that would give us maybe a stronger lead into that area, Mr. Elliott.
Kind of, and the difficulty with that is if you're accepting that it's adjoining, then it must, the policies are mutually exclusive. You're either under policy 6 or you're under policy 19. Right. Okay. So if you're accepting it's adjoining, you're only looking at policy 6 because
okay,
supplementary
right. I'm sorry, I didn't quite grasp that. If we go with the housing in the countryside policy, that it's clearly an extension of a building group.
Right. Well, that would be you accepting it's not adjoining, so therefore policy 6 not apply, and you're then, from what I understand, you're accepting it does accord with development plan in the sense of housing countryside guidance, and it's an extension to an existing building group.
Yes.
Sorry, Convener, I didn't.
It's far better to have that clarification, Mr. Elliott, although depending on on Councillor Illingworth's view, it may not be necessary, but we'd better see. We'll see now what Councillor Illingworth's view is. Can we hear from you? Councillor Illingworth?
Yeah, just sorry. Yeah, I'm in favour. I agree with everything that Councillor Wilson has said. I'm in favour of this application. Councillor Wilson discussed the challenges around connecting to main sewerage. Agree with him on that. We both agree that it would be desirable to keep as much of the original historic hedgerow as possible. My only other concern would be that I would far rather see a slate roof than a concrete tile roof, but that's a completely subjective point of view. But I completely agree with what Councillor Wilson has said, but we still have the issue of trying to solve getting the wording right, so we may not be able to solve that wording issue.
Thank you, Councillor Illingworth. So Mr. Elliott, you have our decision, which is 2-1. Are you happy? You have sufficient information from Councillor Wilson to articulate this?
Convener, I'm just writing here. It's grant subject to suitable conditions, informatives, and I will say possible legal agreement, because there's obviously a reference in the papers to a contribution. Now that contribution is quite small, so it's very likely that it'll be asked for up front, but we'll make the provision for a possible legal agreement just in case. And the justification, as I heard from Councillor Wilson, is that accords with policy 19 and the housing and countryside policy or supplementary guidance 2020 as an extension to an existing building group. Now that's by majority. Convener, of course, you're the dissenting minority to refuse. The only other thing to do would be to turn to Mr. Harrison as to whether he needs any more guidance in terms of conditions.
Yes, so Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, have you any further view on this?
He's there.
He seems to be there.
Yeah.
You may be muted.
Can I ask you, Audrey, to check if Mr. Harrison is still with us?
He is still with us, however, he is on mute.
Right, I think hopefully you can hear us and come off mute.
My apologies. I was actually looking up the countryside guidance details at the same time. And I note the desirability. I think Councillor Wilson and Illingworth both said to retain the hedges, which you saw in the photographs, and also, as we can see from the photograph here, the openness on one of the sides in relation to the rest of the field. So a landscaping condition would seem appropriate there. The reference to mains drainage, or the desirability being connected to mains drainage, and the provision of SUDs would seem to be part of that. One of the things which hasn't actually, I don't think, been mentioned so far, but is referred to in the papers, is whether or not it's desirable to have a footpath link along the frontage of the application site or not, whether or not you wish that to be conditional. I noted the reference Councillor Illingworth made to the roofing material. Again, whether or not you wish that to be subject to further consideration by the planning officers. The only remaining thing was what Mr. Elliott referred to, that the issuing of the planning consent would be subject to contribution in relation to the A9 junction.
Convener, I'm grateful for Mr. Harrison mentioning the issue about the footpath. The reason I think Councillor Illingworth and I were hesitant in mentioning that was it may be that asking for a footpath would lead to the total removal of the current mature hedge. And in the words of the prophet, you can't have it both ways. But it would be desirable to allow the properties in Manyburn Road, of which there are about 10, I think, or 10 or 12, to allow them to have a safe path to get into the village and on the main road if they're catching a bus or coming back from any of the businesses in Britain. So I think it would be appropriate to get. I don't know how we word it, Mr. Harrison, is whether we ask the applicants to investigate the feasibility of. Would also be possible to plant a hedge, a new hedge behind the footpath, and whilst the hedge is substantial and mature, hedges are like trees; they're a renewable source, so they can be taken away and replanted again. But I would accept your professional advice on that and how we tackle that one, Mr. Harrison.
Thank you. I'm noting here that Councillor Illingworth wished to say something too.
Yeah, when I looked at the most recent design, that included both the current hedge and the footpath, which would narrow the road somewhat, but it would allow both a hedge and the footpath.
And there seem to be, as you say, two possibilities: either narrowing the road slightly in order to ensure that there's a footpath, or accepting that or three possibilities: accepting that the hedge, or at least parts of the hedge, may be lost because of the difference in levels that's having to be accommodated if a footpath is to be, shall we say, dug into the slope. Another alternative would be to look again at the layout. The site, as I think was mentioned, is fairly generous for two plots. You could even contemplate retaining the hedge and providing a footpath within the application site, albeit that would reduce the garden space to some extent. But as the plots are fairly generous, that wouldn't seem to be, shall we say, technically impossible to have the footpath behind the hedge, albeit it would involve a second hedge possibly being created to define the curtilages of the houses.
The image on page 650 does include a plan for a path and while keeping the existing hedge.
Yes, it does, but I would suggest that it's I think you'd probably want to really translate that directly onto what's physically on the ground as well, and not just solely rely on the drawing. But what the drawing doesn't maybe give you a full indication is the differences in levels between the road and the site at certain points.
Yeah.
So I think then, Mr. Elliott, are you near a conclusion here?
Well, I think, Convener, obviously you have a 2-1 decision to grant subject to suitable conditions and formalities and a possible legal agreement, which I mentioned earlier on, and on the basis that it accords with policy 19, housing countryside supplementary housing 2020, as an extension of the investment group. Mr. Harrison's obviously got some guidance from councillors as best as possible on conditions, and I appreciate there is a little bit of uncertainty over the pavement, but my estimation is the priority is retention of the hedge.
Mm-hmm. Right, so are you happy with that as it stands, Councillor Wilson?
Yes, and I'm very grateful for Mr. Elliott's help in teasing these things out, because I think it's quite important that we obey the rules and regulations as well as everybody else. So I just want to, while we're still in public, I want to record my thanks for him making me go through the rules, and that's perfectly, that's what he's paid to do, and he does it very well.
Yes, that's what we're here to do, Councillor Wilson, quite right. And so, Councillor Illingworth, are you now happy that everything is as you wish?
I'm content, yes.
Right, thank you. So, thank you then, Mr. Elliott. So you have our decision there, and the applicant will be very pleased, and I think they will agree we've certainly given this a very thorough examination. So that brings this meeting to a conclusion. I would finish off simply by thanking Councillor Wilson and Councillor Illingworth for volunteering once again to serve on this committee, and to thank Councillor James for waiting in the background just in case. So with that, I'll close today's meeting. Thank you all for your attendance.
And thank you to all the efforts of the officers as well.
Indeed.
Absolutely.